Welcome to episode 34 of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast, a bi-weekly look at cybersecurity, including interviews, news, expert tips, and the latest trends. I'm Kevin Baxter, and I'm joined by my Firewalls.com colleague, Andrew Harmon.
Hello there.
Hey, Andrew. As we tackle a different featured topic each episode. New ones are normally out every other Wednesday, so subscribe or follow on your favorite podcasting platform to get the latest first. Please do rate and review us, or you can drop us a line anytime at podcast@firewalls.com. As always, thanks for listening, and now it's time to introduce our featured topic and our guest for this episode.
Well, 2020's been a year, hasn't it? While no one would have predicted a pandemic altering the course of daily life around the world at this same time last year, in the network security arena, there were some trends that looked to become greater issues as the calendar turned. One of those trends particularly, that WatchGuard had included in its 2020 Cybersecurity Predictions, was a growth in breaches occurring outside the perimeter due to a growing remote workforce, which, as we now know, has grown much faster than anyone could have predicted.
That is a lot of growing. 2021's predictions take this shift a step further with the idea that hackers will look for further ways to take advantage of telework by using those inherent vulnerabilities to access corporate networks. To discuss both last year's predictions and what else may be in store for the future, we welcome back returning guest Marc Laliberte, Information Security Threat Analyst with WatchGuard Technologies. Marc, thanks very much for joining us.
Hey, yeah, thank you very much for having me back. It's good to be on again.
The prediction business has been a little iffy lately.
It really has. Normally we do, we consider 60% passing or so in terms of what we hit. But man, 2020 sure threw a wrench into the engine for what we were thinking was going to occur.
Yeah, for a lot of things. So actually starting with that a little bit, how has the pandemic and COVID really impacted what your day-to-day has been in terms of your work and how it's been affected?
Yeah, luckily for me and the rest of my team, we all were pretty used to working remotely as it was. So it was a really easy transition for us, and even for WatchGuard as a whole. We were already set up as a security company to be able to facilitate a lot of remote workers securely. So obviously there were still some growing pains along the way as we had to quickly shift and basically kick everyone out of the offices. But we were able to handle it pretty well, and I think a lot better than other similar size organizations that aren't in the security business were able to do. So it definitely could have been worse. But I mean, I feel bad for our IT team and probably the amount of help desk tickets they got for VPN usage along the way.
Sure, yes. So as we mentioned earlier, the 2020 predictions did expect a rise in some telework vulnerabilities growing in both volume and, sophistication. So how have those expectations been sort of shattered by even more and more remote workers than originally expected?
Yeah. So we originally made these predictions back in November of last year. So before this pandemic was even a thing. It might have been stewing in China, but obviously it wasn't a global issue by then. But we still, there were still trends that we were following where there seemed to be this push towards a remote workforce and enabling employees to maybe work remotely full time or at least a couple days in the office, a couple days outside. And so we predicted that this growth of remote work would fuel a new attack surface for cyber criminals that are going after those people outside of the office perimeter. Because in general, when you're in an office, you're protected by multiple layers of security all the way from the perimeter down to the endpoint. And if suddenly you pull that employee out of the secure office network, they're working from home or a coffee shop or somewhere else, they're potentially missing a few of those layers, which could make them easier to attack. So that's where that prediction came about. Man, we had no idea just how true it would become when we made it. And really, like you said, it's basically our expectations have been shattered this year, largely because most of the world had to quickly migrate to a remote working model, at least in some fashion. And even though some are starting to make their way back into the office, it's feeling like this is going to stick around for quite some time or even permanently in some cases. People have gotten used to working from home, which means that organizations now have to facilitate that basically.
And how much was that overnight to switch to working from home exacerbating the vulnerabilities?
Yeah, it's anytime you have to do something quickly in the world of IT, usually means that it's at the cost of security. So organizations had to really quickly spin up this infrastructure to support their employees no longer being in the office. That meant mobile VPNs to connect back into office resources if you were doing it well. Could just be exposing some of those resources externally if you weren't doing it so well. And when you're doing it quickly like that, and not necessarily like you're basically just trying to say, okay, we'll make it work and then we'll secure it. Sometimes you forget to secure it, or sometimes you don't even think to. And it really opens up a lot of avenues for attack for cyber criminals to go both after the individuals working remotely and then now after those exposed services that you have back at headquarters or wherever your office might be.
Right. So another 2020 prediction that sort of ties into this discussion is the idea that multi-factor authentication would become standard even for, smaller businesses, mid-sized companies. Have we seen that come to fruition? How would you grade the response in 2020 to adopting multi-factor auth?
That one I'd have to I wouldn't give it a full pass. I also wouldn't give it a full fail. Like if you just think of it on the face, for small and medium businesses, do they use multi-factor authentication? The answer is probably yes in some form or another, whether it be certain accounts, maybe just their privileged accounts, maybe just to specific services. But it really hasn't quite become as fully ubiquitous as every single user has multi-factor enabled for all of their at least important accounts. That still hasn't quite taken off. And that, we knew that it was a bit of a far reach to say that it would become just wide in just the course of a year. Like every SMB would be able to set up MFA and use it. But we do at least still see with the push towards remote workers, a lot more of a focus on protecting authentication as well. So at least in some cases, its usage did go up.
And so with both the telework and the MFA, we're kind of using those 2020 predictions as a preamble to get into your 2021 predictions, which are out now also. Overarching theme is that attackers will look to breach corporate networks through their remote workers. So what methods do you see for how this is going to be playing out?
Yeah, we've got a few of our 8 predictions are really geared towards this whole remote workforce that is still interfacing with a corporate network, whether that be at a data center or back at the office. And for example, one of our predictions revolves around attackers going after the insecure home networks that people are typically working from now. So like I mentioned earlier, instead of having those layers of security all the way from the perimeter down to the endpoint, now a lot of people are just using consumer grade routers that might have a firewall that they might have actually enabled. And then from behind that, they're still connecting back into their main office. They're connecting to cloud web apps that they're using, but they're missing a lot of that perimeter based security, which means it's potentially easier for something to get in through that perimeter onto whatever endpoint they have. And it doesn't even necessarily have to start on their work laptop. Maybe it's just one of their children who are doing school from home. And if they're anything like me when I was in junior high and high school, they're potentially going to websites that are pretty laced with malware. And if one of them get a virus or a worm in this case, it could potentially spread to other systems behind that unprotected perimeter now. And so our prediction kind of revolves around, we're going to see network worms really targeting the home, maybe going after IoT devices to gain a kind of foothold or a bastion, as we call it, and then pivot from there and try and locate the more sensitive resources like a company laptop that then connects back to a corporate network over a VPN. And that could enable a breach in that form. We also have other predictions based around just attackers going after remote access services as well. So one of them is attackers swarm VPNs and RDP as remote workforce swells. And this is kind of a continuation of just that growth in remote workforce that we've seen over the last year, where we've had to spin up these tools to enable people to connect back into the office to access services. And while VPNs are in general more secure than just exposing RDP access, for example, so remote desktop protocol hooking right into a computer, it doesn't mean it's 100% secure. They're still vulnerable to authentication-based attacks, especially if you're not using multi-factor authentication. They're still vulnerable to brute force attempts to get into them. And then when it comes to RDP, that's even more vulnerable to those same style of attacks as well. So we're expecting cyber criminals to really start going after these remote access tools and remote access services as companies start to realize that much of their workforce is probably going to remain working from home for quite some time.
Right. So you mentioned that, on premise, you kind of have that full scale end-to-end security, whereas when you're sending workers home, in some cases, they might have very outdated endpoint protection. And one of the predictions for 2021 was attackers beginning to pinpoint the security gaps in these older legacy endpoints. And that can be just things from, older operating systems, older security platforms. What can be done to sort of shore up the less than ideal home setup for some workers?
Yeah, and it's a tough situation to solve in a lot of cases. Obviously, if it's a company-issued workstation, you have significantly more control over it, which means that you are hopefully keeping up to date with the latest operating system patches. You're keeping some form of restrictions on what can be installed on it. You hopefully do have a strong endpoint protection and endpoint detection response service running on it. But sometimes it's the employees basically just using maybe their own laptop, or they're at least on a network with other unprotected endpoints too that could allow an attacker to hammer away and try and find gaps in that protection. But really it boils down to the visibility first and foremost. So knowing what is connecting to your network, knowing what's running on those systems that are then VPNing or accessing applications on your network, and then knowing if you need to install security updates or if there are at least pending ones as well. That prediction, one of the big topics on it was the end of life support for Windows 7, basically, which ends in January of 2021 for extended support too. So that's going to be a big issue going forward as well, where we saw it with Windows XP. That stuck around for quite some time, even after extended support. We expect to see similar with Windows 7 as well.
So in addition to that, another way that people might be looking to get into a corporate network is through spear phishing. And one of your predictions deals with a potential exponential increase in that methodology too.
Yeah. So we've seen over the past few years more and more ways to automate phishing attacks. And with non-spear phishing attacks, so just the normal, untargeted, no real extra context about the victim, those are super easy to automate. You can basically fire them off to whoever you want. But spear phishing historically has still required some bit of manual process. So the attacker has to do reconnaissance on their target. They have to figure out who they work for, who they work with, what their methods of communication are, what their mannerisms of communication are. Then they have to create a message that mimics all those. And then they have to handle responses from the victim that falls for that hook. But we've now seen a lot of automated tools come out, like scraping of social media. Clearview AI, for example, proved that that type of technology really scales well to basically scrape all of the information available for anyone on social media. And we're expecting cyber criminals to pair tools like that with then like AI models that can be fed a bit of info and write a whole article. And then with those paired together, we should see more and more automated phishing attacks where they automate gathering the information, they automate picking their victims, automate crafting the messages, and it allows them to then launch these attacks at really massive scale. And while they'll still remain less sophisticated and easier to spot than true manual spear phishing messages that get a bit more love from their authors, the sheer volume of them is still going to cause some issues going forward.
Maybe time to coin a new phrase for this then. Whatever the mass phishing is, dredging, I believe.
Hey, a good one.
There we go.
So getting back to the multi-factor authentication, that was a big piece in 2020, and it's making itself known again here in the 2021 predictions. And you guys are really doubling down here and saying that any service that does not have multi-factor auth will suffer a breach. What sort of spurs that confidence?
Yeah, so I get that this one's a bit extreme, but it's actually one that I fully believe in as well. And basically it boils down to authentication attacks and data breaches are now a daily occurrence. We've seen almost every single day another notification of another service that's lost millions of records of their users that are now available for sale and for free on the dark web. And all these breaches have fueled these massive collections of now cracked credentials that are available for sale and for free on the dark web and even just underground forums. Like my team maintains our dark web scan infrastructure, and our database right now is at 28 billion usernames and passwords that we've acquired for free. So you could imagine a motivated cyber criminal that's willing to pay money to other cyber criminals, the amount of credentials that they could get a hold of too. And these databases then paired with automated attacking tools and automated attacking techniques really means that no internet exposed service is going to be safe from cyber intrusion if it isn't using MFA. Because in the end of it all, our end users are still unfortunately not so hot at picking strong and unique passwords for each of their accounts, which means that it might be easy for a criminal to use something like credential stuffing, so reusing credentials from one of these breaches to try and target another service then, or even just password spraying to try common passwords against accounts they know exist, and could enable them to then log into other services and then breach them as well. So basically, we made this prediction in that it's so easy these days for a criminal to get a hold of or try and guess one of your passwords or just breach it. And if you're not using MFA, it means that that service will likely suffer at least one breach or at least one account compromise in the coming year.
Yeah, that's pretty scary to think about when you consider all of the different places people put their usernames and passwords.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact that people that aren't using password managers still tend to reuse the same password across many of those services, which means that if one of those gets breached, now all of them are vulnerable.
Eesh. A little bit of a cringe there. And one more prediction that we'll touch on here without spoiling the whole thing for everybody, but this other one stuck out to me as well. You're predicting that smart cars could get hacked by booby-trapped chargers. So we've heard about this happening with charging ports with cell phones and things like that before, but how do you see this one playing out and what are the implications?
Yeah, so we always try and have one kind of moonshot prediction in one of ours. And this one, I think it's safe to say that this qualifies as our moonshot for this year, but it's still at least grounded in realistic trends that could happen. So smart car security and electric car security has really been a big topic ever since 2015 with those Chrysler and Jeep hacks that we saw really take the world by storm. But an area that we think still been under-researched is the charging infrastructure for electric vehicles specifically. So while the charging cables don't really pass data in the same way that our cell phones do, they do still have a data component for when it comes to managing charging safety. And we've seen examples of pranksters using tools like USB killers, where basically it's a capacitor hooked up to a USB port. If you plug it into something, it'll charge it up and then zap it and fry its internals. We could see something similar to a booby-trapped smart charger as well. So it's not necessarily like hacking the car and breaching the data or taking control of it through the charger, but a little bit more of like the malicious prankster style of putting out these smart chargers or tampering with one that could then cause real damages to a vehicle that plugs it in.
Well, and you even mentioned the possibility of a ransomware infection occurring through a charger as well.
Encrypt your car.
It all depends. Yeah, exactly. That would be pretty rough, pull into the grocery store and come back out and realize you got a ransom note out there on your display. But it's, again, grounded in at least trends of seeing criminals try and look for new ways to target new technologies. And this is still a very fresh technology for electric cars and smart cars and the data that they can communicate within themselves and then within charging infrastructure. And I think until we see more research piled into it, it is an actual threat.
Well, it kind of goes back to what you were saying with remote work. Sometimes it's get it done and worry about security later. And so this is sort of the testing period for that, right?
Exactly. And the good news is companies like Tesla are taking this really seriously. So we're better than we were in other industries like IoT, where security was a complete afterthought. Like a lot of these car manufacturers, especially after the Chrysler hacks, the Jeep hacks, have really woken up and hired security teams. They participate in hacking conferences like DEF CON to really try and find these flaws before they become a serious issue for their fleets.
Well, we will definitely keep an eye out this year and see if maybe this prediction will come true at least once.
Yeah, we'll definitely see.
So the rest of the complete report, I know a lot of it is in video form with some further information there. Where can people find the 2021 predictions?
Yeah, it's WatchGuard.com/predictions. We've got a nice landing page there with, again, details on each of the 8 predictions we made this year, why we made them, what they each mean, and what the trends are that are driving us to make them. Definitely check that out. I'm pretty happy with what we put out this year. And again, I'm looking forward to seeing exactly how it's going to all play out. I can't imagine it's going to be any crazier than 2020, so maybe we'll actually have a chance.
Yeah, hopefully.
Call you up again next year and see how this plays out.
Exactly.
And people can also find you on Secplicity and the 443 podcast as well, right?
That is it. Yes, thank you.
All right, Marc, thanks very much for joining us.
Hey, thank you again for having me on. It was good chatting with you guys again.
Yeah, appreciate it.
It's time again for Ransomware Reckoning, in which our Firewalls.com colleague Andrew Nita shines a spotlight on a high-profile ransomware case because, hey, there are a lot to choose from. In this edition, we hear about an attack that led to an unplanned extension of one school system's Thanksgiving break.
We're going to highlight an attack on the Baltimore public school system. 2 days before Thanksgiving, Baltimore school teachers started to notice technical difficulties while inputting grades. What they didn't know was that they were witnessing firsthand a ransomware attack that would affect up to 115,000 students. The district's website, email system, and grading system all have been impacted by the incident. At this point, it's not known whether student data was exposed. As of right now, evidence suggests that Ryuk ransomware was used in the attack. Unfortunately, the attack has had a major impact on the Baltimore public school system. Classes have been canceled the Monday and Tuesday following Thanksgiving, with classes predicting to be resumed on Wednesday. Time and time again, ransomware hackers prove there are no rules or limits to who they target or attack. Stay tuned to the Ping podcast for updates on ransomware attacks all across the globe.
Now it's time for headlines. In this regular segment, we take a closer look at a few top stories in the cybersecurity world and what they may mean to you. Now, headline number 1. Average household hit with 104 threats each month. So we just recently discussed the pretty astronomical number of threats the BBC faces on any given day, upwards of 280,000 via email alone. But what about the average home user? Well, according to Comcast's Xfinity Cyber Health report, an average household on its service faces 104 attacks a month. So it's obviously not an apples to apples comparison, but it gives more insight into some of those threats that are out there.
Right, and so this is part of a larger study that combined both Xfinity's XFi advanced security system data with a actual survey conducted in September of 1,000 adults. So this is a bit of a combination between what people think and feel about their security as well as the actual statistical reality behind it.
Right, and so how do they get that 104 a month? XFi, which is Xfinity's Fi advanced security system, reportedly blocked nearly 6 billion cybersecurity threats since January. So they extrapolate that out over their user count and the days and the months and all that kind of stuff. And voila, you get that 104 number per month.
Right, and nearly 95% of respondents underestimated the volume targeting their household. So the average was actually 12 attacks that people believed they were under each month, and turns out it was 10 times more that almost.
Yeah, a wee bit higher, though, I guess even saying that they think there are 12 is some sort of recognition that there's stuff coming at them all the time.
Right. So according to this survey, 8 in 10 consumers said that they were not confident that they'd know if one of their non-screen devices, we're talking IoT devices, they are not confident in their ability to know if it had been hacked or not. So how exactly do you tell if your thermometer has been hacked?
Yeah, that's a little tricky unless someone's actively messing around with the temperature or turning your security camera the wrong way, or your printer's suddenly printing some random stuff that has nothing to do with you. Those are some signs. But otherwise, if they're not trying to tell you that they're doing something, then you probably won't know.
One thing that I found a little amusing is that same statistic, 8 in 10 users that were surveyed, also said that they were, in fact, taking the necessary security precautions to protect their home networks, even though they had no way to know if those precautions would work. So
yeah. And in fact, of those 8 in 10, 64% simultaneously said they also shared passwords with family members and friends or reused passwords, among other questionable behaviors that could certainly expose themselves to attacks.
Right. And according to XFi, the average house has 12 devices in their home, with the higher end users having an average of 33. Personally, I don't think I'm anywhere even needing 12 in my house.
Yeah, I think I kind of have limited the IoT devices in my house too. So yeah, I don't think I'm up to 12 or anything.
I've got a dumb house, so.
Sometimes dumber is safer.
Right.
Interestingly, though, the most vulnerable connected home devices include laptops, computers, smartphones, tablets, all the obvious stuff, and then networked cameras, networked storage devices, and streaming video devices. So I guess when you add up all those, I might be around 12 if you think about it. But
yeah, other than what you've listed there, I'm not sure what other options there are. Refrigerators, cooling systems.
Yeah, which basically anything beyond that core group that we just talked about are a little bit rarer devices for somebody to have anyway, so you would assume they wouldn't be as commonly attacked.
Right, and keep in mind we are discussing this on the heels of our interview where we just talked about how home users have exploded in growth, so this is a bit worrying of a survey.
Yeah, it's a pretty good tie-in, and another reason why you can see that there are vulnerabilities at home. Going back a little bit more to the knowledge of individuals, one, we're not covering this story today, but you had found a story recently that talks about a lack of cybersecurity training among those people who have become remote users.
Right.
But they haven't had any training in the last year or so they don't know what they're doing necessarily. And this survey also did talk to its survey respondents to see how well they knew certain threat terms. And while some of the terms they knew, even the ones who knew the terms weren't too confident in defining them.
Right, so our 5 categories that were tested here: malware, phishing, IP spoofing, DDoS, and drive-by attack.
Yeah, and so malware, 65% of those respondents had heard of it, but only 35% of those said they could confidently explain it, which is, I mean, that's already kind of crazy if you've heard of a term, but you're not exactly sure what it is. Phishing, 53% had heard of it, and only 28% said they could confidently explain it. And then we drop way down for the next few terms.
Yeah, the IP spoofing, only 16% of people can confidently explain what IP spoofing is. I'll admit that's a bit more complex of a topic than just malware or phishing.
Yeah, but even only 34% had heard of it. And then in terms of a DDoS attack, the proportionality is a little better there, with 18% who have heard of it, 10% felt confident in explaining it. And then lastly, the drive-by attack, 18% again had heard of it, but only 9% can confidently explain it. So that means the knowledge gap is a little bit troubling too. It's not necessarily the most troubling thing, because as long as they are taking proper security measures, it's not as important to know exactly what all these terms mean, but it's just another sign of some problems there.
Right, and certain neighborhoods, drive-by attack can mean completely different things. I'm really surprised that 35% of people had never even heard of malware. They need to tune into our show, I guess.
Yeah. That one I thought would have been, especially for people who are connected online, which I would assume is sort of a self-selecting thing in this group, to not be really well aware of malware or phishing for that matter. I think those terms are really out there, but of course we live in our own cybersecurity bubble, so maybe they just don't circulate as much as we think they do.
Yeah, it's not as popular out in the outside world as it is here, but there is one positive from this survey. 93% indicated that security is at least somewhat important to their purchasing decisions. And remember, this is a consumer survey, not a business survey.
And that is a good thing to hear, especially when you consider what we've talked about over the past year plus on this show. One of those issues is those IoT devices not having security built in. But if they do start to do a better job of building security in, then maybe that will tip the balance for consumers. And so it's good that they're at least considering that fact.
Yeah, hopefully some of their purchasing decisions will lead them to some cybersecurity training along the way.
Now, headline number 2. 3 arrested for cybercrime operation targeting 150 countries. In another major multinational cybercrime investigation apparently coming to fruition, 3 Nigerian nationals have been arrested in Lagos for their suspected involvement in business email compromise scams. And Andrew, who are those 3 people?
Well, there is 32-year-old OC, the letters, that's not a name I'm mispronouncing. These are all acronyms. 34-year-old IO, 35-year-old OI, and another accomplice who actually stepped aside and went to an old farm, EIEIO.
Boy.
So they are believed to be part of a larger group called the TMT. I didn't actually catch what that stands for, did you?
No, I was just saying Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but it's missing the N, so I don't know.
They've grown up now.
Yeah, so these are all, well, the people who are named are all identified only by these acronyms by the organization that is Interpol. But yeah, I'm not sure if I did come across the TMT full name. Anyway, though, it has been involved in malware distribution, phishing, and extensive BEC fraud, according to Interpol.
Right, and these guys are up to just about everything you would think of in a large cyber attacking syndicate like this. So phishing links, squatting domains, mass mailing, all sorts of remote access Trojans. If you can think of it, they've probably had a little bit of their hands in it.
Yeah, they impersonated representatives of organizations. They used that to deliver 26 different malware families, including spyware and remote access tools. And they are believed to have targeted government and private sector companies in over 150 countries since 2017. And data extracted from devices pertaining to those 3 arrested individuals has helped identify approximately 50,000 victims.
Wow. So this operation to bring them to justice was in part helped by a group out of Singapore called Group IB. And as you said, since their arrest, some data that was unlocked by their arrest has sort of helped identify how many victims there are, as well as maybe some extrapolation that over 500,000 businesses could have been targeted by these people.
Yeah, that's quite a bit. And this operation called Operation Falcon, another strong name. A lot of these cybersecurity operations have some strong names associated with them. Very majestic.
Yes.
So it was a year-long investigation conducted by Interpol, also with Group IB, as you said, and assistance from the Nigerian police. And Group IB also said that this particular TMT organized crime group is divided into subgroups, and says that a number of individuals who are members of the subgroups remain at large.
Right, and so the phishing emails that they sent were sent out using platforms like Gammadyne Mailer and Turbo Mailer, with MailChimp being employed to track who opened and clicked messages. And they were looking to steal login information from browsers, emails, FTP clients, really anything they'd get their hands on. But the exact way that they monetized after an attack is still unclear and under investigation.
Yeah, so we don't have information on exactly how much money this group has made in this operation. You would assume it's a pretty substantial amount with the number of victims, the number of countries, the number of businesses, all of that.
Right, and it seems like this is something that's been going on for quite a while, so.
Yeah, so we're talking at least 3 years worth, and thousands of victims, many of whom have probably quite a bit of money to be had. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see and follow up information exactly how much money came out of this.
And Interpol Cybercrime Director Craig Jones seems pretty optimistic about, the potential for what this could all mean. They were running a pretty well-established business model as far as cybercrime is concerned, and Interpol is looking to kind of continue this and find more people involved with TMT and all these associated subgroups that you mentioned.
Yeah, and as we said, again, we've covered a couple of others of these types of busts recently, which have been pretty large in scale, going after cyber criminals involving multiple countries, multiple agencies investigating. So that all seems like a pretty good sign in the fight against cybercrime.
Right. And so with these three fellows now behind bars, hopefully that will help facilitate more legitimate emails coming out of Nigeria, and maybe that prince can finally get his money.
Yeah. I mean, he's been waiting years, so hopefully somebody. Yeah. On to headline number 3. This new cyber attack can dupe DNA scientists into creating dangerous viruses and toxins. A group of researchers says a new form of cyber attack can target biotechnology. The report from Ben Gurion University of the Negev describes how unwitting biologists and scientists could actually become victims of cyber attacks, which could lead to actual production of biotoxins and synthetic viruses.
Right, and their research was recently published in the academic journal Nature Biotechnology. The name of the article is Cyberbiosecurity, Remote DNA Injection Threat in Synthetic Biology. If that gives you any idea of how complicated this story will be.
We will try our best here. So it documents how malware used to infiltrate a biologist's computer could actually replace substrings in DNA sequencing. So I think the overall gist here is, if I understand it correctly, that malware can actually sort of change the instructions on how somebody is working to create, say, a medicine or a vaccine or do DNA sequencing, and inadvertently cause them, well, it's advertently by the person who puts it in there, but cause them to inadvertently create something not so good.
Right, and so a biologist could be working on a certain project and he needs to order a type of DNA synthetically generated, so that's something you can apparently buy online is synthetic genes and have them shipped to you. I did not know that. But the idea here being that an attacker could insert themselves into that order, change the substrings, as you said, in the genes that were ordered, and then the scientist would then receive the wrong order on the other end and potentially mess up his secret formula.
Yeah, and the mess up could lead to biological weapons, basically.
Right. So there is some already automated protocols sort of meant to help with these. When DNA samples are ordered, they are matched up against a DNA screening best matched system. But in a particular study that tested this, 16 of 15 obfuscated DNA samples were not detected by this system. So there's some obvious holes in that foolproof plan.
Yeah, 16 out of 50 is what? Around like a third almost of those DNA samples. So those aren't great odds, really. I mean, there's some level of security there, but maybe not as much as you'd like.
Right.
So software used to design and manage synthetic DNA projects may also be susceptible to man-in-the-browser attacks that can be used to inject arbitrary DNA strings into genetic orders, and that can facilitate what the team calls an end-to-end cyberbiological attack.
Right, and to put this a little more in layman's terms, imagine you are trying to design a recipe and you need some milk powder, and you go online and order milk powder, but the hacker changes your order to tomato powder, and now you have a tomato cake. A biologically devastating tomato cake.
Yes, yeah. And you wouldn't really want to eat that tomato cake either if you were craving a milk cake.
Exactly, yeah. And with, the current circumstances of a COVID-19 pandemic sort of gold rush at the moment, there's a lot of room for things to go wrong with this particular type of attack, even as complex and maybe obscure as it may be.
Yeah, and basically it takes out the need to be physically present to mess with all of these biological agents, where in the past you'd think that, they can't mess with our actual physical production that we're doing right here, but now they may be able to just because they're getting into that supply chain situation or instructional situation just by a cyber attack.
Right, and obviously these are so complicated and granular. We're talking substrings of a DNA sequence. Nobody has the time or really expertise to stop and check every single sequence that's sent their way. So you kind of have to trust the process a little bit. And if people can now mess with that process, it can spell some real disaster.
Yeah, and that disaster can be synthetic viruses or other toxic material. Basically, one of the folks involved in the study says this attack scenario underscores the need to harden the synthetic DNA supply chain with protections against cyberbiological threats. To address these threats, we propose an improved screening algorithm that takes into account in vivo gene editing. So I did not look up what in vivo means before I said it out loud, but...
But it sounds very smart, and I think he may be correct.
Yes, we need to take that into account. And the bottom line is cybersecurity touches every facet of the world, and cyber attacks can cause all sorts of real world issues. As you said, the vaccine rush that's happening right now, we've already talked about how people are targeting these vaccine makers, World Health Organization, all of that. And now we know maybe another way that they might try to target them.
Right, and while this all does seem pretty headed in the clouds and a little disconnected from reality, they were able to actually sort of come up with a use case for this. So they cited a residue Cas9, which is a protein that is used with CRISPR protocols, so DNA sequencing, if you're familiar with the CRISPR project, and it's used to deobfuscate malicious DNA in cells. Well, you can mess with some of the recipe, so to speak, and turn it into active pathogens based on this same protein.
Yeah, just by using malware, you can make that change. So just another thing to maybe keep you up at night, for the next few weeks of 2020. Thanks for listening to this episode of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast. And thanks again to WatchGuard's Marc Laliberte for joining us. Check out the links in the description for more information about everything we discussed. Subscribe or follow now, however you listen, to ensure you get our latest episodes as soon as they're available. And please do rate and review us. Visit Firewalls.com for all your network security needs and give us a follow on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. For Andrew Harmon, I'm Kevin Baxter. We'll be back soon with another episode. But in the meantime, we remind you to get secure, stay secure.